This Euro crisis has turned the terms of the debate inside out from the British point of view. If I look back at the way people saw the European proposition when we first went in 40 years ago, most people, I would argue, in Britain, most people saw it as a trade-off between the politics and the economics. You know, we would lose a little bit of sovereignty, and that was a bad thing, but it would be offset by gaining some prosperity. Nobody looking across the Channel today still believes in that equation. We see what's going on, and my constituents are very clear that the EU means a loss of democracy and a loss of prosperity. Whatever rationale there was for going in has been overtaken by events. Here's a grisly statistic. The year that we went in, 1973, Western Europe, which I'll define for these purposes as the 15 members of the EU as they stood prior to the admission of the Eastern post-communist countries, Western Europe in 1973 accounted for 38% of world GDP. Today it's 24%, and in 2020 it will be 15%. We thought we were hitching our wagons to a powerful locomotive. In fact, we shackled ourselves to a corpse. Instead of joining a prosperous and growing market, we have confined ourselves in a cramped and declining customs union, and in doing so, my friends, we have cut ourselves off from the bits of the world where the growth still is. Not least our friends in this country and in the wider community of English-speaking democracies. Truly, that was the worst mistake that my country has made in my lifetime. And from it, so much flows in terms of the diminution of our democracy, the emptying of our seas, the destruction of our countryside, the asphyxiation of our small businesses, now the threat to the City of London, to our financial services industry. It all goes back to that fateful decision to hand away our right of self-government. And that's why, like so many people from the United Kingdom, when I come to this country, I can't help feeling a terrible wistfulness to think that this is how it might have turned out. This is how we might have been if we had not handed away our right to live under our own laws and our own people. You know, my constituency is 22 miles from Europe. But when I travel in Europe, I speak French and Spanish, as your chairman said, but I'm among strangers, among friends by all means, but not among countrymen. Here I'm almost as far from the United Kingdom as it's possible to be and still be on dry land. But although I'm in a different country, I'm not among strangers. We're linked by habits of law and language and sentiment and speech. And it was an extraordinary decision that our fathers made to forsake those ties in favour of this accident of geography that placed us nearby. And the great news is that rationale has now been overtaken by technology. You could just about argue in the 1950s, you could maybe even hear a little echo of the logic in the 1970s that the world was dividing into regional blocks and that you needed to be part of one in order to have clout. I mean, frankly, I think the argument was fairly bogus even then. Right? The idea that you have to be part of an enormous unit in order to be prosperous is not borne out by the facts. If size were a prerequisite for prosperity, China would be wealthier than Hong Kong, Indonesia would be wealthier than Brunei, the EU, for that matter, would be wealthier than Switzerland. That is not the case. But I can sort of understand the argument as it stood then. Nowadays, it has simply been made redundant by the technological revolution. A company in my constituency will find it much easier to do business with a firm in Melbourne than to do business with a firm in St Malo, just across the Channel. Because the company in Melbourne will be, first of all, English-speaking. Secondly, it will use the same accountancy systems. It will have the same business practices and the same kind of unwritten codes of business ethics. It uses the same common law. If there's a dispute, both parties will be familiar with the arbitration mechanisms. None of those things are true within the EU, despite 40 years of directives aimed at harmonization. In other words, the internet has shown up the EU for what it always was, an unwanted 1950s hangover. A redundant trade bloc in a world that has moved beyond it. You know, it's not only that our commercial profile has been overtaken by events. As well as redirecting our trade and our politics, our intellectual elites in the United Kingdom tried even to redefine how we thought of ourselves as a people. One bit of research I did before coming to Australia was to look up some of the references to Australia and the EU in the British media, and I came across the most wonderful written at the time of your last federal election in 2010, in The Guardian, which is our main kind of left-of-centre paper. It was written by a classic soft-left Europhile columnist, and it was entitled, "The Internet Has Trapped Us in the Anglosphere." And it was written in a very peeved tone, and the author began very crossly by saying, all the British public are more interested in the Australian election on the other side of the world than they are in events in Nord-Pas-de-Calais. And he was honestly advancing this as a shocking proposition. What a revealing glimpse into the extent to which our intellectual elites believed that they could not only artificially redirect our politics, but actually artificially redirect our news agenda and what we were supposed to be interested in. You know, I mean, stand back and think about it for 2 minutes. How could we not be interested in what was happening here? This is where our family are. This is where our phone calls go. Your parliament is similar to ours. The forms of address are similar to ours. The parties are closely linked. I can't think of any party that exchanges personnel as much with mine as your Liberal Party, and I think that the two Labour parties are even more closely linked, which perhaps explains why they're both in the current predicament that they're in. But the idea that we should not follow with interest and sympathy what's going. Both of the party leaders had been born in the United Kingdom, for heaven's sake. I apologise on behalf of one of them, but I mean, you know, it would have been a truly extraordinary thing. And yet, the presumption of the bien-pensant Europhile elites in London that they thought that because they said so, we would start thinking of ourselves as a European people and would forget these older alliances forged over generations with our sundered kindred across the seas. And what's it based on, that relationship that we have in common? Is it just an accident of language, or is there something else to it? Well, you know, I can't help thinking that when we talk about the West, when we talk about the community of free democracies, as a political concept, we're really talking about the Anglosphere. The countries that have actually been prepared in a consistent way to take up arms in defense of freedom are the English-speaking democracies. What is it that our polity is based on? What is it that makes us different from our immediate neighbours? What is it that I, as a British politician, have in common with your system here that I don't have in common with our immediate neighbours in France or in Belgium, or indeed with your immediate neighbours in Indonesia or wherever? Well, it starts with a truly extraordinary thing. The more time I've spent studying and reading about this, the harder it becomes to explain. But we're set apart by something utterly sublime, which is the common law. This almost miraculous development, this idea, lost in prehistory, that the law is not subject to the government, but that rather the government is subject to the law. That legislation doesn't emanate from the state, but rather there was an inherited folk right of existing statute, and that even the king and his ministers were subject to it. How did we invent that? I have no idea. We inherited it, our parents inherited it, and so on, back to some point in the early Anglo-Saxon settlements. Nobody knows how it happened, but it happened. And that defined a certain kind of relationship between government and governed that I think sets apart all of the English-speaking democracies. It perhaps went even further in the United States, where it was encoded in a constitutional form in Philadelphia. From that belief that the government is the servant of the citizen, rather than the other way around, flows everything else. Representative democracy, personal freedom, the idea that laws should not be passed nor taxes levied except by our own elected representatives, the idea that the executive should be subject to the legislature, they all go back to that extraordinary idea. And here's another thing that it's given rise to. Another part of our shared patrimony as Anglosphere countries. The notion that there is a civic rather than an ethnic definition of nationhood. At the time of the Federation in Australia, 80% of British subjects were neither white nor Christian. Multiculturalism, although we didn't call it that then, is not a new concept. But although there were varieties in how people lived, there was a community of identity. There was this extraordinary idea that if you signed up to the values, if you believed in personal freedom, in parliamentary supremacy, then it didn't matter where your parents were from. And that was an extraordinarily powerful idea. And it still is. You know, we don't define our nationality, as a number of our European neighbours do, in terms of blood and ancestry, or in terms of territory or birth. We define it in terms of belief. It doesn't matter whether your ancestors came to Britain from Jamaica or from Bangladesh. It doesn't matter whether they came to Australia from Korea or from Vietnam or even from the Netherlands, John. Anyone is able to have a share in that extraordinary heritage. And in defence of that shared inheritance, our fathers, mine and yours, were prepared to take up arms in defence of our right to live with our traditional freedoms. Hundreds of millions of young men, twice in the last century, were prepared to cross half the world in order to fight for a country that in most cases they'd never set eyes on, because they felt themselves to be common heirs to that extraordinary tradition. That, my friends, is our greatest gift, we English-speaking democracies. That is our truly glorious patrimony. Let's hold fast the freedoms that we inherited from our parents, and let's pass them on intact to our children.